Yeah, so my name is Ashley Clendenen. I am a graduate student at Georgia Tech. I work with Dr. Tom Orlando on the Reveals project. And today I'll be telling you about a recent study that was just published in Earth and Planetary Science Letters on a comparison of the lunar regolith simulants to the lunar regolith by temperature program desorption. Okay. So as a little bit of background, there has been a very limited supply of regolith, which has actually been returned from the moon. Hopefully we'll have more soon, but right now we have to use regolith simulants, which are designed to be chemically and physically as similar to the actual regolith as possible. But because it was created in a different environment, there will be differences. However, sometimes we work under the assumption that both the regolith and the simulants will behave the same way in certain experiments, which is not necessarily true. So the goal of our study was to compare how the regolith simulants LMS1 and LHS1 compare to the actual regolith in order to gauge sort of how accurate these simulants are for certain experiments. And so the comparisons that we looked at were chemical and physical characteristics, as well as temperature programmed desorption, or TPD experiments, which looked at water, hydrogen, and then also calculated the effective activation energy of water desorption. So the samples that we used were Apollo 14163, which is a Highlands sample, and then the simulants LHS1, which is a Highland simulant, and LMS1, which is a Mare simulant. And so this first graph is the mineralogy of the simulants compared to this particular sample of regolith, and then the composition in terms of oxide species. And they are a fairly close match in this regard. So we also looked at the physical characteristics. So we calculated the specific surface area using BET, and we found for LMS1 it was 1.45 meters squared per gram, and for LHS1 it was 0.53. So BET measurements can vary kind of widely depending on the particular gas that you use, but literature values do sort of suggest that these are good simulants in comparison to actual regolith. We also used an in-house code to look at the circularity, effective diameter, and the effective surface area, and those graphs are shown here. So the top is for LMS1 and the bottom is for LHS1. And the peak values we found are listed on here. And so then we did some temperature programmed desorption experiments. So our TPD apparatus, a schematic is shown here on the slide. And so the samples were mounted on a stainless steel sample holder in ultra high vacuum at lunar relevant pressures, and then heated to initial temperature of 300 Kelvin by a dual filament tungsten heater. And then they were heated to 1300 Kelvin at a heating rate of 0.5 Kelvin per second. And then the temporal desorption species were measured by a quadrupole mass spec, and then the temperature was measured by a type K thermocouple. And we also did a blank run using the exact same conditions to correct for background signals. So these are the results we have for the TPD of water. For the first graph is for LMS1, and then LHS1, and then the Apollo sample. You can see that the general shape of the graphs is pretty much the same. So the dashed line in each of these is the experimental signal. We also fit this signal with a TPD fit, which is calculated from assuming there's a contribution from the vacuum grain interface, which is the surface of the sample, and then the void space between the grain-grain boundaries within the volume of the sample. And these fits were calculated from kinetics equations described by the Poligny-Wigner equation. If you want to know more about this particular fit, I recommend reading this Jones paper, which is cited here, which goes over it in detail. And so we also calculated the exact amount of water which was released per sample, and we found that there was 176 parts per million released from the LMS1, 195 from the LHS1, and 103 from the Apollo sample. And while it's true that there was more water released from these simulants, we can sort of use that as a way to calibrate our experiments, because if we know this, we can then assume that if we run the same experiments with a regolith, we can just sort of approximately half the amount of water that we expect to get. And then we calculated the effective activation energy of water formation and desorption, which was fitted by an asymmetric double sigmoidal function, which is this equation here. And this is our graph. So it's the probability of each activation energy. And then the peak probabilities that we found for the Apollo sample was 151 kilojoules per mole. For the LMS, it was 152 kilojoules per mole. And for LHS1, it was 148 kilojoules per mole, which is all pretty similar. So we also did temperature program desorption of hydrogen. And this is where our results are particularly interesting. So this graph shows the TPD results for the Apollo sample. However, there was no hydrogen from the TPD of the simulants. And this is particularly interesting because it demonstrates that the solar wind proton bombardment is actually pretty strongly influences the behavior and the chemical state and the general reactivity of the regolith where hydrogen is concerned. So there was 69 parts per million of hydrogen released during the experiment from the Apollo sample, but again, none from the simulants. So the conclusions, the simulants are chemically and physically pretty similar to the actual regolith. There is 1.9 times more water released from LHS1 and about 1.7 times more released from LMS1 than from the Apollo sample. And the most probable effective activation energy of water formation and desorption from all three samples is about 150 kilojoules per mole. And then sort of the most important or interesting result is that the hydrogen released from the actual regolith, but not from the simulants, which is a significant difference caused by the lunar environment. So does this mean that we can't use these simulants for hydrogen experiments? Well, no. We just have to find a way to artificially expose them to space weathering and particularly proton bombardment in order to make them behave more similarly to the actual regolith, which is ongoing work in our lab. So yes, thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I would take them now.
Any questions for Ashley in the room?
Hi, Anna Martin, Applied Physics Lab. Have you thought about doing these with other types of lunar simulants besides Exolith?
Yeah, so our lab has done some previous work with JSC 1A, and we have papers published on that you can look up. But yeah, we've done it with some other simulants as well. Well, differently is the short answer.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Michael Poston. How many times were the TPD experiments repeated, and how much did the results vary from lot to lot?
So for the simulants, we repeated them a few times, and the results were pretty consistent. The Apollo sample, because just there's so little of the sample, it was only done once. But our results are pretty similar to previous work that we've done using other Apollo samples, so we think that it's pretty accurate.
Okay, we have another question from the chat from Brad Jolliffe. Nice work. How long was 14163 exposed to terrestrial environment? And did you do any tests of H2O desorption as a function of time in air?
In air, we did not, I don't believe. And how long was it exposed? We tried to keep the simulants as isolated as possible, but there is always exposure when you're moving it to the experimental apparatus, and so there is some exposure to the environment.
Any more questions in the room?
Hi, Parvati Frame, APL. Really cool work. So maybe following on from Anna's question, do you also have plans to maybe look at desorption of other volatiles?
Yeah, we do have plans for that in the future.
Any particular volatiles? Just curious.
I'm not entirely sure. It's something we're discussing, which ones to look at.
Thanks.
Okay, we're gonna move on. Thank you, Ashley.